A fortune can be the heaviest burden you never asked to carry. This is the story of the Gilded Age heiresses, young American women whose million-dollar inheritances bought them titles, palaces, and lifetimes of profound misery. By the end, you will understand the dark price paid for trading vast wealth for social glory. We will uncover why so many of these glittering marriages ended in scandal, isolation, and even madness. Was it simply bad luck, or did the money itself carry a curse? What do you believe is the true cost of a golden cage? That weight, that sense of an inescapable fate, is the very essence of a cursed fortune. It is far more than a simple string of bad luck. A cursed inheritance is one that seems to carry a malevolent energy, a psychological poison that corrupts everything it touches. It often begins with the immense, isolating pressure of sudden wealth, a burden few are prepared to carry. You are handed not just money, but a dynasty's crushing expectations. Your life is no longer your own. It becomes a project, a ledger entry, a tool for maintaining a legacy you did not build. This pressure is compounded when the wealth's origins are shadowed by guilt, perhaps built on exploitation, or when it is the subject of bitter, endless family disputes. Historically, superstitions have always clung to such fortunes. Whispers that money stained by suffering or deceit will inevitably bring suffering to its heirs. For the young American heiresses of the Gilded Age, their dowries of millions were the ultimate double-edged sword. The money was their passport into the ancient, hallowed halls of European aristocracy, a ticket to a crown. But in the eyes of their new families in a watching, judgmental world, that same fortune made them a target. They were seen not as individuals, but as walking bank accounts, objects of both envy and contempt. Their wealth was the reason for their marriage, and thus it became the chain that bound them to it. Every glittering tiara, every vast estate, served as a constant reminder that they had been purchased and that their primary value was transactional. This set the stage for a specific and particularly devastating form of curse, one where the very thing that granted their greatest wish also guaranteed their profound unhappiness. The stage for this great exchange of cash for class was the Gilded Age, a period in late 19th century America where industrial titans amassed fortunes so vast they seemed almost fictional. Men with names like Vanderbilt, a store, and good-built empires in railroads, steel, and finance, creating wealth that dwarfed the treasuries of many European nations. Yet, for all their financial power, they faced a stubborn social barrier. In the eyes of the old money elite of New York and Boston, they were still new money, their wealth too raw, their names absent from the sacred pages of the social register. They had the mansions and the yachts, but they lacked the one thing money could not easily buy: centuries of established lineage and the respect that came with it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a mirror image problem existed. Europe's ancient aristocratic families, living in drafty castles and sprawling estates, possessed titles that stretched back to the Middle Ages. They had the bloodlines, the coats of arms, and the social prestige, but they were running out of money. Their lands were expensive to maintain, their lifestyles unsustainable, and many were on the brink of financial ruin. It was a perfect, if cynical, match. And so, a new kind of royalty was born not by conquest or birth, but by brokerage. They were called the Dollar Princesses. These were the daughters of America's industrial kings, raised in opulence and groomed for one purpose: to be traded as brides to cash-strapped European nobles. For the American families, it was the ultimate social validation, a way to launder their new money through old titles and secure a legacy among the world's true elite. For the European aristocrats, it was a simple business transaction, a desperately needed infusion of capital to save their ancestral homes and fund their genteel poverty. The princess's dowry, often amounting to many millions of dollars, would restore a roof, modernize a manor, and secure a family's future for another generation. In return, the American heiress received a title, a coronet, and a permanent place in the highest echelons of society. On paper, it was a brilliant solution. But this transactional foundation meant the marriage began not with love or even mutual affection, but with a ledger. The bride arrived at her new home not as a partner, but as a creditor, a walking, talking rescue package. And the weight of that transaction would come to define and often destroy her new life. Into this world of calculated matrimony stepped a young woman who would become its most famous and tragic symbol. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and her story is the textbook definition of a fortune that cursed its owner. At the age of just 18, she was one of the wealthiest heiresses in America, the daughter of railroad magnate William Vanderbilt. But her true value was not measured in her grace or intellect. It was quantified in a single, staggering number: a dowry of $2.5 million, a sum equivalent to over $75 million today. This fortune was not a gift. It was a weapon wielded by her formidable mother, Alva. Alva Vanderbilt was a woman of ferocious social ambition, determined to vault her family into the absolute pinnacle of global aristocracy. For her, Consuelo was not a daughter to be cherished, but the ultimate bargaining chip. Alva orchestrated a courtship with the most eligible and most financially desperate nobleman she could find, Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The Duke possessed one of England's most illustrious titles and its grandest non-royal home, Blenheim Palace. But the palace was a magnificent ruin, its roofs leaking, its vast rooms cold and dilapidated. He needed an American fortune, and Alva Vanderbilt was ready to provide one. Consuelo, however, was in love with another man, a suitable American suitor of her own choosing. Her mother would have none of it. Alva reportedly locked Consuelo in her room, staged dramatic scenes of ill health, and emotionally brutalized her daughter until she surrendered. On the day of her wedding, Consuelo wept behind her veil, a bride marching toward her gilded cage. The marriage was a transaction fulfilled. The Vanderbilt millions flowed across the Atlantic, funding a magnificent restoration of Blenheim Palace. The leaking roofs were fixed, the art collection replenished, the gardens returned to glory. Consuelo's money saved a national treasure, but for Consuelo herself, Blenheim became a prison of cold grandeur. The palace's 300 rooms echoed with loneliness. Her husband, the Duke, was distant and made little secret that he had married for money, not for love. He was reportedly cruel, dismissing her interests and maintaining a separate life. Consuelo, the Duchess, fulfilled her duty, bearing 2 sons to secure the lineage her fortune now supported. but she lived in isolated splendor. Her immense wealth, the very thing that had purchased her title and restored a palace, became the bars of her confinement. She was trapped in a life of exquisite misery, her personal happiness sacrificed on the altar of social ambition and financial rescue. The curse was clear. Her inheritance had bought her everything in the world except the freedom to live in it. For nearly 2 decades, Consuelo Vanderbilt endured her gilded prison at Blenheim Palace. The loneliness within those 300 rooms was a constant companion, a quiet ache beneath the glittering surface of ducal life. Yet, the world was changing around her. The rigid social structures that had forced her into this marriage were beginning to crack, and a new century brought with it whispers of personal freedom. In 1920, after the First World War had irrevocably altered the old aristocratic order, Consuelo did something extraordinary and scandalous. She sought a divorce from the Duke of Marlborough. In an era when divorce was a social atom bomb, especially among the nobility, her case shook high society to its foundations. It was a landmark moment, not just for her, but for women of her class. She was no longer the passive dollar princess purchased for her fortune. She was a woman actively choosing to reclaim her life, regardless of the cost to her reputation. The divorce was granted, and though it came with its own set of challenges and public scrutiny, it represented her first true act of agency since childhood. Liberated from her title and her miserable marriage, Consuelo's story takes a remarkable turn. This is where the narrative of the cursed inheritance transforms. The same vast wealth that had been the instrument of her confinement now became the tool of her liberation and purpose. She did not retreat from the world. She engaged with it passionately and on her own terms. Consuelo dedicated the rest of her life to philanthropy and, most significantly, to the fight for women's suffrage. She used her financial resources, her social intelligence, and her hard-won understanding of female powerlessness to fund and champion causes that empowered other women. She worked tirelessly, not as a duchess performing charity, but as a citizen advocating for fundamental change. Here lies the profound paradox at the heart of her tale. The Vanderbilt fortune was indeed a curse. It bought her a title and delivered 2 decades of profound unhappiness. It trapped her in a life scripted by others. But once she seized control of her own narrative, that same fortune became something else entirely, a force for genuine good. It funded hospitals, supported educational initiatives, and amplified the voices of women fighting for the right to vote, a right that would have given her younger self a very different kind of power. This suggests a possible redemption arc from the curse of such an inheritance. The poison was not in the money itself, but in the lack of autonomy over it. When the wealth was controlled by others, used as a bargaining chip to purchase a life she did not choose, it was a destructive force. But when Consuelo finally grasped the reins, the curse lost its power. She resurrected that energy, transforming the weight of her gilded cage into a foundation upon which she could build a meaningful life. Her story asks us a difficult question. Can a fortune that ruins one chapter of a life be redeemed in the next? For Consuelo, the answer was a quiet, powerful yes. She found a purpose that her purchased title could never provide, using the resources of her curse to break chains for herself and for others. Yet her path to freedom was the rare exception, not the rule. For every Consuelo who managed an escape, there were many more heiresses who found the walls of their golden cages to be utterly unbreachable. Their fortunes led them down a much darker and more isolating path, one where the curse manifested not in quiet misery, but in a very public unraveling of the mind. Long before Consuelo Vanderbilt wept at the altar, another American girl crossed the Atlantic with a fortune and a fearless spirit, setting the template for all the dollar princesses who would follow. Her name was Jennie Jerome, and she would become famous not just for her marriage, but as the mother of one of the 20th century's most towering figures, Winston Churchill. Jennie's story shows that the curse of a transactional inheritance could strike even when the dowry was relatively modest, and the bride was anything but passive. Her father, Leonard Jerome, was a flamboyant financier and sportsman known as the King of Wall Street. While his wealth was impressive, it was not the earth-shattering industrial fortune of a Vanderbilt. What Jennie brought to England was not just money, but a dazzling, almost shocking, New World vitality. She was a brilliant pianist, a captivating conversationalist, and possessed a confidence that British aristocrats found utterly disarming. At a royal regatta on the Isle of Wight in 1873, she met Lord Randolph Churchill, the younger son of the Duke of Marlborough. It was a whirlwind romance. He was charmed by her beauty and her spirit. She was taken with his title and his political ambitions. Their engagement was announced within days, but here, the familiar shadow of the transactional curse fell. The Marlborough family, though prestigious, was in one of its periodic financial crises. Leonard Jerome's money was a welcome solution. After tense negotiations, a marriage settlement was agreed upon, securing an annual income for the couple. Jennie's American fortune had, once again, greased the wheels of aristocratic survival. Yet, from the very beginning, Jennie's money and her personality made her a permanent outsider in the rigid world of Victorian high society. A British aristocracy prized bland obedience and quiet decorum in its women. Jennie Jerome was a whirlwind. She was witty, politically engaged, and had a taste for lavish spending on clothes, entertaining, and her own comforts. She was too vivid, too intelligent, and too independent. The very qualities that made her fascinating also made her suspect. She was tolerated for her money and her connections, but she was never fully embraced. This status as a perpetual outsider was compounded by relentless scandal. Jennie was known for her many romantic affairs with powerful men, including high-ranking politicians and royalty. While her husband, Lord Randolph, was often preoccupied with his own political career and health struggles, Jennie lived life on her own audacious terms. The British press and society gossips feasted on her behavior, which was considered shockingly brazen for a woman of her station. Her American heritage was often used as a convenient excuse for her conduct, as if a moral looseness came with the New World banknotes. But the financial strain was a constant, quieter scandal that ate away at the foundation of her life. Despite the marriage settlement, the Churchill family was perennially short of funds. Lord Randolph's political career was expensive, and Jennie's own lavish tastes drained resources. They lived far beyond their means, accruing debt that would haunt the family for years. The Jerome fortune, intended to provide stability, seemed instead to fuel a cycle of spending and anxiety. Jennie often had to use her own charm and connections to secure loans, a humiliating process for a duchess in waiting. Her money did not buy peace. It bought a precarious and stressful existence on the glittering edge of ruin. In Jennie Jerome, we see a different facet of the curse. It was not the silent, lonely misery of Consuelo, but a vibrant, noisy, and public struggle. Her inheritance granted her entry, but it also painted a target on her back, ensuring she would always be judged as the brash American heiress. It provided funds that were simultaneously essential and never enough, trapping her in a web of financial insecurity and social disapproval. She used her wealth and her force of personality to carve out a space for herself, but that very act of self-creation ensured she would never fit in. The curse for Jennie was a life of magnificent, scandalous, and expensive friction. The Jerome fortune was a ghost that haunted the Churchill family for generations, a restless spirit of need that demanded constant feeding. For Lord Randolph Churchill, the pressure to live up to his wife's dazzling American wealth and to fund his own soaring political ambitions became an all-consuming engine. Political life in Victorian England was not a public service. It was a ruinously expensive private pursuit. Campaigns, social entertaining, maintaining multiple homes, all required a river of money that the Churchill family estates simply could not provide. Jennie's dowry and her father's support were the fuel, but it was never enough. Lord Randolph was perpetually scrambling, his brilliant political mind often distracted by the humiliating and desperate search for funds. This relentless financial anxiety is believed by many historians to have contributed to his notoriously poor health and the mysterious illness that led to his political and physical collapse at the shockingly young age of 45. The man died with his ambitions unfulfilled, his family's finances in tatters, in the shadow of debt longer than ever. That shadow fell directly onto the shoulders of his young son, Winston. From his earliest memories, Winston Churchill understood that his family was titled, brilliant, and perpetually on the brink of financial disaster. He watched his mother, Jennie, use her charm and her fading American connections to negotiate loans, sell jewelry, and perform a dazzling high-wire act to keep up appearances. The lesson was seared into his psyche. Security was an illusion, and only relentless personal effort and monumental achievement could possibly keep the wolves from the door of their ancestral home. This ingrained insecurity became the furnace of his legendary ambition. Winston Churchill drove himself with a ferocious energy that often bewildered his contemporaries. He sought fame, political office, and literary success not merely for glory, but as the only means to generate the vast income required to sustain the Churchill name. Every book he wrote, every lecture tour he endured, every political risk he took was, in part, a transaction to settle a debt to the past. The Jerome fortune's curse was thus metabolized into a kind of furious greatness. It gifted him nothing material, but it implanted a psychological imperative that helped forge the indomitable will the world would later rely upon in its darkest hour. Yet the personal cost was immense. This same driving need led him into speculative financial disasters, like the devastating loss in the stock market crash of 1929, which wiped him out and forced him to write frantically to recover. It strained his personal relationships and created a lifelong sense of anxiety beneath the bulldog exterior. The inheritance, then, was a poisoned chalice that flowed down the generations, from Jennie's transactional marriage to Lord Randolph's desperate career to Winston's burdened brilliance. It proved that a curse is not always a quiet decay. Sometimes it is a roaring fire that forges steel even as it burns the hearth. If the Jerome fortune was a ghost, then the good fortune was a monster. It belonged to a man whose very name was a synonym for ruthless greed in the Gilded Age, May Goelet. As a railroad tycoon and financier, he was widely considered the most reviled man in America, a predator who manipulated markets and ruined competitors without a shred of remorse. His death left an estate worth an almost unimaginable $75 million, a fortune stained in the public eye with the blood of broken dreams and financial panics. This was the inheritance that fell to his daughter, Anna Gould. She was a small, quiet, and decidedly plain young woman who possessed none of the dazzling beauty or charisma of a Jennie Jerome. Her sole attraction in the brutal marriage market of the aristocracy was the colossal, toxic weight of her bank account. And in 1995, she found a buyer who was not the least bit shy about the transaction. His name was Count Boney de Castellane, a French aristocrat from an ancient but impoverished family. He was everything Anna was not: flamboyant, charming, witty, and breathtakingly handsome. He was also a professional spendthrift with a single, magnificent talent. He knew how to burn through money with theatrical, legendary style. He did not just marry Anna Gould for her money. He celebrated the fact. Upon receiving the first installment of her dowry, reportedly several $1,000,000, he is said to have exclaimed with delight, "At last, I have the funds to really be myself." And so he was. Boney de Castellane treated the good fortune as his personal fantasy fund. He built a monstrous pink marble palace on the Avenue du Bois in Paris, filling it with priceless antiques, rare tapestries, and rooms dedicated solely to his collections of porcelain and walking sticks. He threw parties that became the stuff of European legend. One featured a lake of real perfume. Another recreated the court of Louis XIV with hundreds of costumed guests. He showered jewels on actresses and lavished money on every whim. Anna, the source of it all, was relegated to the background, a silent, drab spectator at her own financial execution. In the glittering salons of Paris and New York, she was not a countess. She was a punchline. The whispers were cruel and constant. They called her the Pocket Venus for her petite stature, a doll purchased by a profligate prince. They mocked her lack of style, her American awkwardness, all while her husband spent her inheritance on a circus of excess designed to impress everyone but her. Her money, already seen as dirty and ill-gotten, was now being publicly set on fire for entertainment. The curse here was one of spectacular humiliation. Anna's inheritance did not buy her respect or love. It bought her a magnifying glass that focused the world's scorn directly upon her. She was trapped in a marriage where her sole function was to fund her husband's vanity, her very identity erased by the sheer, garish spectacle of her own fortune being wasted. The good name, synonymous with shameful wealth in America, became in Europe a synonym for foolish, gullible excess. Anna had purchased a title and a prince, but the price was her dignity, making her the ultimate emblem of the heiress as a living, breathing joke. The Palais Rose stood as a monument not to love, but to brazen consumption. This sprawling pink marble mansion, built by Count Boney de Castellane with Anna Good's money, was a physical manifestation of the curse. Every column, every gilded cornice, screamed of wealth so vast it could be used as a plaything. Boney did not just build a home, he crafted a stage for his own performance, filling its halls with genuine 18th century treasures and hosting parties of such legendary excess that they became the primary gossip of 2 continents. Anna, the woman whose inheritance funded this circus, was never its star. She was the quiet, overlooked patron in the corner, a constant reminder that this was not her world. She had merely rented it for a man who saw her as a bank vault with a title. The public humiliation was relentless and exquisitely detailed in the society pages. Newspapers gleefully cataloged Boney's purchases: a solid gold dinner service, a private zoo, a custom-built yacht, all while noting Anna's plain dresses and subdued demeanor. The contrast was the story. She was painted as the dull American heiress being expertly plucked by a dazzling European peacock, a living lesson in the perils of new money meeting old decadence. The curse was not private misery, it was a spectator sport. Every party Boney threw was a fresh act of public spending, and every headline was a new twist of the knife transforming Anna's vast fortune into the very thing that made her a laughingstock. The final crushing humiliation arrived not in a ballroom, but in a courtroom. When Anna finally found the courage to sue for divorce after 11 years, Boney did not go quietly. He fought her in a series of spectacularly vicious legal battles, demanding an enormous annual allowance from the good fortune as his rightful due. The trials dragged the sordid financial details of their marriage into the harsh light of day. Boney's lawyers argued, in essence, that his services as a charming husband and social guide had a market value, and Anna's inheritance was the agreed upon payment. The court proceedings laid bare the brutal transaction at the heart of their union. Anna was forced to sit and listen as her life was dissected as a business deal gone bad, her personhood reduced to a line item in a budget for aristocratic upkeep. She ultimately won, but the victory was Pyrrhic. Her name was forever linked to one of the most scandalous and mercenary marriages of the era. Anna Good's story represents the curse in its purest, most exploitative form. Her inheritance acted like a beacon, attracting not a partner, but a predator who saw her fortune as a public fund for his private amusement. It purchased a cage where the bars were made of her own gold, and the lock was the world's mocking laughter. The money guaranteed she would never be seen for who she was, only for what she could bankroll. Yet, even in the shadow of such profound exploitation, a question lingers. Could a fortune this toxic ever be cleansed, or was its corrosive power destined to poison every life it touched? The answer may lie in the story of another heiress, one whose inheritance did not lead to a gilded cage or a public scandal, but to a tragedy of a much more intimate and devastating kind. Anna Good's escape from Boney de Castellane was not a triumphant liberation, but a quiet, strategic retreat. The divorce proceedings had been a brutal public dissection, leaving her reputation in tatters and her spirit exhausted. One might have expected her to flee Europe entirely, to return to America and attempt to vanish into obscurity. But Anna did something unexpected. she stayed in France and she married again. Her second husband was no flamboyant stranger, but a man from the very heart of the world that had wounded her, Prince Haley de Talleyrand-Périgord, who later became the Duc de Talleyrand. He was ironically Bonna's cousin. This was not a rebound into another glittering fantasy. It was a deliberate and calculated choice for stability. The Duke was a quieter, more serious man from an even more illustrious lineage, one that valued discretion over spectacle. This marriage was different from the start. There was no frenzy of spending, no pink marble palaces built for show. Instead, Anna's fortune was used for its original, intended purpose: to secure and sustain an aristocratic house. She poured her money into restoring the Talleyrand family's historic chateau and lands, not as a stage for parties, but as a home. She funded a life of dignified, traditional nobility, supporting her husband's diplomatic career and focusing on raising their children away from the glare of the paparazzi. Anna consciously withdrew from the social whirl that had made her a laughingstock. She became a shadow in the very world she had paid so much to enter. But this time, it was on her own terms. The woman who had been a public punchline transformed herself into a private, respected duchess. She managed her vast good inheritance with care, using it not as a weapon for social climbing or as fuel for a husband's vanity, but as a tool for creating a lasting, serene legacy. In this second act, Anna Gould achieved what had eluded so many dollar princesses: a measure of peace. She did not break the curse of her fortune through dramatic rebellion, as Consuelo Vanderbilt had, but through a kind of strategic surrender to a different set of rules. She accepted the transactional nature of her world and played the game with a better, quieter partner. Her money, once a source of humiliation, finally bought her the things she had perhaps always wanted: security, respectability, and a retreat from the mocking eyes of the world. It was a partial redemption, proving that the poison of a cursed inheritance could sometimes be diluted, not by rejecting the gilded cage entirely, but by finding a different, more comfortable corner within it. Yet this path of quiet management was not the only fate awaiting an heiress. For some, the pressure of the fortune and the expectations it carried did not lead to strategic retreat or even miserable endurance, but to a complete and terrifying fracture of the self. The curse could manifest not in scandal or quiet sorrow, but in a very literal loss of one's mind. Mary Victoria Leiter's world was one of plush carpets and polished brass. The daughter of Levi Leiter, co-founder of Chicago's grandest department store, Marshall Fields. Her inheritance was not born of railroads or robber baron ruthlessness, but of commerce and customer service, a fortune built on the desires of a growing city. Yet this respectable wealth would propel her into a sphere of imperial ambition few Americans could fathom. She was a beautiful, intelligent woman, and in 1895, she married a man whose aspirations were as vast as the British Empire itself, George Nathaniel Curzon. He was a rising political star, known for his towering intellect and an even more towering sense of his own destiny. From the outset, their union was a partnership of purpose, but the fuel for that purpose was unmistakably Mary's money. George Curzon's vision for his life required a stage worthy of a statesman, and his family's ancestral home, Kettleston Hall in Derbyshire, was that stage. But like so many aristocratic estates, it was a fated masterpiece, requiring a king's ransom to restore. Mary Leiter's American fortune provided that ransom. Her dowry, a colossal sum for the time, flowed into the stone and mortar of Kettleston, reviving its classical splendor, filling its galleries with art, and making it a fitting power base for a man who saw himself as a future prime minister or viceroy. The money did more than restore a house. It manufactured an image. It funded the lavish entertaining, the impeccable wardrobe, the entire performance of aristocratic power that was essential for climbing the highest rungs of British politics. In a very real sense, Mary Leiter purchased the setting for her husband's greatness. And greatness did arrive. In 1898, George Curzon was appointed Viceroy of India, the pinnacle of imperial service, becoming Lord Curzon. Mary, now Lady Curzon, was thrust into the heart of a fairy tale, becoming the virtual queen of the British Raj. In India, she was adored. She used her charm and her resources to soften her husband's often rigid demeanor, engaging with Indian culture in ways that were unusual for the time and earning genuine affection. She presided over dazzling Durbar ceremonies, a vision in jewels and silks, the American heiress now seated on a literal throne. For a moment, it seemed the transactional marriage had yielded not misery, but a shared, glorious destiny. Her fortune had bought the platform, and together they were standing upon it, shaping history. Yet the costs of funding such an ambition were quietly accumulating, not in public scandal, but in the private currency of a woman's health and spirit. The Indian climate was brutal, and the pressure of viceregal life was immense. Mary, always delicate, began to wilt under the unrelenting heat and the weight of constant ceremony. She suffered miscarriages and developed chronic illnesses, her body struggling to sustain the empire her wealth supported. She was giving more than money. She was giving her very vitality to the dream. The curse here was subtle and insidious. Her inheritance had granted her a crown, but the crown was heavier than anyone could have predicted. The fortune that built the stage was now demanding a performance that was slowly consuming the performer. The glittering court of the viceroy was a world of unbearable heat beneath its silks and diamonds. Mary Leiter Curzon, the vicereine, moved through a schedule of relentless ceremonial duty, from reviewing troops under a blistering sun to hosting elaborate state dinners in halls cooled only by the slow sweep of palace fans. The American fortune that had restored Kettleston Hall now funded the most extravagant court on earth, a necessary theater of power to uphold British rule. She performed her role with grace and genuine empathy, winning the hearts of many Indian subjects, but the physical cost was catastrophic. The Indian climate, so foreign to her constitution, began a slow, steady assault. She suffered from recurring bouts of malaria and a debilitating blood condition, likely pernicious anemia, that left her exhausted and frail. Each grand durbar, each lengthy procession, drained her a little more, even as her husband's star ascended. Her wealth had purchased the throne, but her body was paying the installment on it. She became a ghost in her own palace, often too ill to participate in the very life her money made possible, listening to the distant sounds of imperial pomp from her sick room. After years of this grueling service, the Curzons returned to England. George was hailed as a returning hero, his name forever etched in the history books as one of the great viceroys. Mary returned a convalescent, the woman who had financed the entire enterprise, who had provided the social grace and personal charm that softened his rigid edges, was now an invalid. She died in London in 1906, at the age of just 36. Her relatively early death was a direct consequence of the strains of viceregal life, a life her inheritance had made attainable. The cruel irony is absolute. Mary Leiter's fortune built the platform for George Curzon's historic career. It purchased the health of his ancestral home and funded the splendor that cemented his reputation. Yet in enabling his grand narrative, it consumed her own. She is remembered, when she is remembered at all, as the ailing vicereine, a tragic footnote in the biography of a great man. This is the classic curse of the supporting heiress. Her vitality literally spent as currency to purchase her husband's legacy, leaving her story as a brief, sad preface to his. But what of an heiress who inherited not just money, but a title and a castle directly, only to find it was the loneliest place on earth? The loneliness of Blenheim Palace was a condition that seemed to outlive its occupants. After Consuelo Vanderbilt finally secured her freedom, the vast, echoing halls of the great house did not remain empty for long. Another American woman would cross its threshold, a woman whose story is perhaps the most enigmatic and psychologically haunting of them all. Her name was Gladys Deacon, and while she was not a dollar princess in the traditional sense, her family had wealth, but not the staggering industrial fortunes of a Vanderbilt or a Gould. Her life became utterly entangled with the same cursed legacy of the Marlborough dukedom. She was not purchased for her money, but she was consumed by the same gilded vacuum that money had created. Gladys was a celebrated beauty, famed across Europe for her perfect, classical profile and piercing blue eyes. Artists begged to paint her, and intellectuals were captivated by her sharp, polyglot mind. She was a brilliant conversationalist, fluent in multiple languages, and moved in the most avant-garde literary and artistic circles. This was not a passive heiress being traded. This was a fiercely independent woman making a deliberate and disastrous choice. That choice was the 9th Duke of Marlborough, the same man who had been married to Consuelo. Gladys had known the Duke for years, and they began a long and very public affair while he was still wed to Consuelo. For Gladys, this was not merely a romantic liaison, it was a conquest. She saw herself as the intellectual and aesthetic equal the Duke had always lacked, the true partner for the master of Blenheim. When he finally divorced Consuelo, Gladys believed she had won her prize. They married in 1921, and she became the new Duchess of Marlborough. But the victory was hollow from the start. The Duke, Sonny, was a deeply damaged man, emotionally stunted by his own transactional upbringing and bitter from his first marriage. The estate he presided over was a financial black hole, forever dependent on the infusions of American capital that he both needed and resented. Gladys brought no vast fortune to plug the leaks this time. Instead, she brought her wit, her taste, and a desperate hope to create a true salon, a center of culture at Blenheim. She tried to breathe life into the cold stones, filling the palace with artists and writers, attempting to make it a home of the mind. The Duke wanted none of it. He retreated into his own pursuits, leaving Gladys alone in the very palace she had schemed for years to inhabit. The curse of the Marlborough title, a curse funded by American dollars and sustained by cold duty, began its work on her. Isolated and rejected, the brilliant, vibrant Gladys began a slow, terrifying unraveling. She became obsessed with preserving the beauty that had been her primary weapon, undergoing disastrous paraffin wax injections in her face in a bid to maintain her perfect profile. The procedures went horribly wrong, distorting her features and causing her constant pain. As her physical appearance crumbled, so did her mental state. The woman who had charmed all of Europe descended into paranoia and reclusive madness. She barricaded herself in her rooms at Blenheim, then later in a small cottage on the estate, surrounded by stacks of books and her beloved dogs, seeing almost no one for decades. The Gilded Cage, built by Vanderbilt millions for Consuelo, became a Gothic asylum for Gladys. Her intelligence, which should have been her salvation, instead turned inwards, feeding her delusions and isolation. She had reached for a crown that was, by its very nature, cursed, a title whose value was forever tied to a fortune that was not hers, in a system that had no use for a woman's mind, only for her utility. Gladys Deacon's tragedy completes a dark triad at Blenheim, proving that the poison of a transactional legacy could destroy not just the unwilling bride bought for cash, but even the willing mistress who entered for love and ambition. The palace did not discriminate, it consumed them all. Blenheim Palace stands not as a home, but as a sentence. Its 200 rooms and 2,000 sprawling acres were never designed for comfort or intimacy, but for a single, overwhelming purpose: to proclaim the power and permanence of the Marlborough dynasty. Every stone, every gilded ceiling, every acre of manicured garden whispered the same relentless demand: maintain me. And that demand was a financial vampire, draining generation after generation of dukes. The agricultural income from the land could not hope to cover the costs of leaking roofs, crumbling stonework, and the army of servants required to keep such a machine running. This was the inescapable math that dictated the lives of the Marlborough men, a math that always ended with the same solution: an infusion of American capital. The palace itself, this magnificent national treasure, was the engine of the curse, forcing its owners into a cycle of transactional desperation. The 9th Duke, Sonny Marlborough, was not born a mercenary. He was made one by the endless groans of the estate ledger. His marriage to Consuelo Vanderbilt was not a romantic failure. It was a structural necessity for Blenheim's survival. Her millions literally restored the roof over his ancestral head. Yet the cruelest irony is that the palace, resurrected by the fortunes of these outsider women, then turned on them. For Consuelo, those freshly repaired, echoing corridors became the hallways of her isolation. For Gladys Deacon, the grand rooms she hoped to fill with intellectual salons became the chambers of her solitary madness. The very beauty they financed the restored tapestries. The gleaming parquet floors became the exquisite backdrop to their personal unraveling. Blenheim was the ultimate gilded cage because its splendor was the bait, its history was the lock, and its endless need was the jailer. It embodied a truth far beyond the Marlboroughs, that dynastic obligation, when funded by a fortune you do not control, consumes the individual life. The palace did not care for happiness. It cared only for its own continuation, and it used the hearts of heiresses as currency to pay the bill. The splendor of Blenheim was a trap of stone and expectation, but for one woman, a similar inheritance became a trap of conscience. Frances Evelyn Greville, known to everyone as Daisy, was not an American outsider, but a British heiress born into the very heart of the aristocracy she would later come to question. Her fortune came from the vast Maynard estates, wealth that was intertwined with American railroad money, giving her a financial independence few women of her station possessed. She used it initially to become the absolute zenith of the Gilded Age in England. Beautiful, charismatic, and wildly extravagant, Daisy became the celebrated Countess of Warwick and the longtime mistress of Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales. Her life was a whirlwind of lavish house parties, yacht trips, and exquisite gowns, the very embodiment of a privileged world spending its way towards a new century. She was not a purchased bride. She was a player at the very center of the game, using her wealth to host the future king and cement her place as a social queen. Yet the sheer scale of her fortune and the world it sustained began to curdle within her. The curse for Daisy was not loneliness or humiliation, but a growing, unbearable awareness. While hosting opulent weekends for royalty at her magnificent estate, Easton Lodge, she could not ignore the poverty of the tenants on her own lands and the struggling workers in the nearby villages. The same money that funded her revelries was drawn from an economic system that created such stark disparity. This was a curse of conscience, a moral reckoning that her inheritance forced upon her. After the death of her father-in-law in 1893, which vastly increased her personal wealth, this quiet unease erupted into a dramatic conversion. Daisy Greville, the king's mistress and society's darling, became a socialist. She began reading Karl Marx, formed friendships with radical thinkers like the journalist W. T. Stead, and started pouring her immense fortune into the cause. She funded socialist newspapers, lectured at workers' halls, and campaigned tirelessly for better wages and living conditions. It was a stunning betrayal of her class, a scandal that shocked society far more than any romantic affair ever could. She was using the tools of the aristocracy, her money and her title, to try and dismantle the very system that had created them. But here, the curse revealed its final, ironic twist. Daisy possessed a revolutionary heart, but had no head for finance. Her passionate philanthropy was utterly reckless. She gave money away with boundless enthusiasm, but no budget, funding causes, building schools, and supporting strikes without any sustainable plan. She mismanaged her estates with the same negligence, prioritizing her political projects over their sound maintenance. The vast Maynard fortune, the engine of her rebellion, began to hemorrhage. Debts mounted into the hundreds of thousands of pounds. She was forced to sell heirlooms, jewels, and eventually, vast portions of her land. The woman who championed the working class was ultimately ruined by her own noble but chaotic generosity. Her story is a poignant paradox, the curse of an inheritance that awakened a social conscience so powerful it blinded her to practical survival. The wealth that showed her the world's injustices also financed her attempt to fix them, only to collapse under the weight of its own unguided virtue. In the end, the Countess of Warwick's fortune cursed her with a clarity she could not ignore and a mission she could not afford, leaving her both spiritually awakened and financially desolate. The socialist countess was being crushed by the very stones of her own history, while Daisy Greville poured her fortune into radical newspapers and workers' housing. an even more voracious financial beast demanded constant feeding: Warwick Castle. This was not just a home, it was a medieval fortress, a national monument, and a crushing responsibility that descended upon her after the death of her father-in-law. The castle's upkeep was a legendary money pit. Its ancient walls needed constant repointing, its vast roofs leaked, and maintaining its sprawling grounds required a small army of gardeners and laborers. The castle was a living entity that consumed pounds sterling as its daily bread. Daisy's inheritance, already strained by her philanthropic zeal, now faced this monumental, inescapable drain. Every check she wrote for a socialist pamphlet was a check she could not write for repairing the castle's crumbling Norman tower. Her fortune was being pulled in two impossible directions: funding a future of equality while preserving a bastion of the very inequality she now opposed. The conflict was not just ideological, it was a daily, grinding financial reality. The castle stood as the ultimate symbol of the aristocratic system she was trying to dismantle. Yet it was her duty, her legacy, and her family's shame to let it fall into disrepair. So she tried to do both, and in doing so, she bankrupted them all. The money flowed out in a torrent, funding political rallies and patching castle stonework, supporting striking dockworkers and heating the castle's cavernous Great Hall for the few guests she still entertained. There was no budget, only conviction and crisis. She sold land, but it was never enough. She mortgaged properties, digging the hole deeper. Finally, she turned to the castle's own treasures. The accumulated heirlooms of centuries, the tangible history of the Greville family, were liquidated to pay the bills. In a series of heartbreaking sales, she auctioned off priceless Renaissance paintings, exquisite French furniture, and rare porcelain collections. Each item sold was a piece of her heritage converted into cash to fuel her present cause or placate a pressing creditor. The castle's rooms, once filled with art and evidence of a lineage, grew barer and barer. The ultimate indignity came in 1928, when the financial pressure became unbearable. Daisy was forced to sell the entire contents of Warwick Castle in a spectacular auction that lasted for weeks. Furniture, tapestries, armor, even the kitchen pots and pans, everything went to the highest bidder. The great fortress was stripped to its bare walls, a hollow shell of its former grandeur. It was a public spectacle of ruin, a visible, undeniable sign that the Countess of Warwick's fortune had been utterly consumed. This was the curse in its most complete form, a fortune intended to sustain an aristocratic way of life for generations had, in the hands of an idealist, accelerated its own decay. Her wealth did not allow her to transcend her birth. It magnified the conflict until it tore everything apart. The castle stood empty, her coffers were empty, and her revolutionary dreams were left unfunded. The inheritance had granted her the clarity to see the system's flaws and the means to fight them. But in the end, the weight of the very world she was trying to change collapsed upon her, leaving only a stripped castle and a cautionary tale about the cost of conscience when it is backed by a checkbook, but not a plan. Amidst these tales of ruin and heartbreak, one story gleams like a quiet, polished gem. May Goelet was the heiress to a $20 million fortune, a staggering sum even among the Gilded Age elite, built from New York real estate and railroad investments. In 1903, she married the 8th Duke of Roxburgh, a Scottish peer with vast lands and the historic Floors Castle. On the surface, it was the same old transaction, American money rescuing a historic British estate. Yet, by all contemporary accounts, theirs was a genuinely happy union. They shared a love of the outdoors, of their Scottish home, and of a relatively private family life. There were no sensational divorce trials, no public humiliations, no whispers of misery echoing through the castle halls. So why did May Goelet's inheritance seem to bless rather than curse her? The answer may lie in a subtle but crucial alchemy of character and circumstance. Unlike the Marlboroughs, the Duke of Roxburgh was not perpetually on the brink of financial catastrophe. His estates were well managed and productive. May's fortune was not a desperate rescue package. It was an enhancement, a means to undertake grand improvements without the soul-crushing pressure of imminent ruin. This changed the entire dynamic. Her money was a gift, not a ransom. Furthermore, both May and the Duke appeared to possess a temperamental aversion to the glittering, judgmental social circus of London. They preferred the quiet, misty borders of Scotland to the ballrooms of Mayfair. By choosing a life of relative seclusion, they insulated themselves from the relentless gossip and scrutiny that tormented women like Anna Gould. Their happiness was not a public performance. It was a private reality. Perhaps most importantly, their marriage seemed to be founded on a genuine mutual affection that grew over time, a partnership that viewed the fortune as a shared tool for building a life, not as the sole reason for the union. May Goelet's story serves as a vital counterpoint, proving that an American fortune did not automatically sentence an heiress to despair. The curse was not inherent in the money itself, but in the toxic ecosystem it entered, a system of desperate need, public spectacle, and emotional vacancy. When the fortune met a stable foundation, a private life, and a measure of real affection, its power could be harnessed for contentment, even legacy. But this peaceful outcome was the rare exception, a delicate balance that required luck as much as judgment. For every May Goelet who found quiet happiness, there were countless others whose inheritances acted as magnets for a far more sinister and predatory kind of attention, attracting not just titled suitors, but entire families who saw the heiress not as a person, but as a renewable resource to be controlled at all costs. So was it truly a supernatural curse, or something far more predictable? Stepping back from the individual tragedies, a clear and chilling pattern emerges. These were not random strokes of bad luck, but the inevitable results of a system engineered to fail the women at its center. The so-called curse was a perfect storm of social and financial pressures, where human beings were reduced to commodities. At its heart was the transaction itself. These were not marriages founded on love or companionship, but on a coldly negotiated exchange, cash for a title. From the moment the dowry was agreed upon, the heiress entered her new life with a price tag hanging around her neck. Her value was quantifiable, and once paid, her personal worth in the eyes of her husband and his family often plummeted. She was the purchased asset, now expected to be a silent, decorative, and fertile ornament. This dehumanizing dynamic was then supercharged by a profound cultural clash. The American heiresses were raised with a spirit of independence and outspokenness that was utterly alien and often threatening to the ancient, rigid hierarchies of European aristocracy. A woman like Jennie Jerome, with her political opinions and dazzling wit, was seen not as brilliant, but as brazen. The very qualities that made them individuals became liabilities, marking them as permanent outsiders in a world that demanded conformity. Their new homes were not sanctuaries, but gilded prisons governed by stifling, centuries-old protocol. Every action, from how one addressed a duke to the order of entering a dining room, was dictated by rules designed to reinforce status and suppress spontaneity. For a vibrant young woman used to some measure of freedom, this constant policing of behavior was a form of psychological suffocation. Into this volatile mix stepped the suitors themselves. While not all were outright predators like bony decaying, the financial desperation of the European aristocracy created a marketplace where gold digging was not a vice, but a survival strategy. Men were raised from birth to understand that their primary duty was to secure the fortune necessary to maintain their family's legacy, by any means necessary. Love was a secondary concern, if it was a concern at all. This meant the heiress often faced a husband who was, at best, indifferent to her happiness, and at worst, openly resentful of the financial dependency she represented. Finally, layering over all of this was the immense, inescapable pressure to produce a male heir. This was the ultimate return on investment. The fortune had been paid to save the estate and the title, and now the heiress's body was required to secure the lineage that would inherit it. Her worth was tied directly to her fertility. Failure to produce a son was a catastrophic breach of contract, a personal and public shame. Success meant her primary duty was fulfilled, often leaving her isolated in a marriage that had achieved its sole purpose. When you combine these factors, the curse reveals its true nature. It was not a mystical force, but the systemic outcome of treating women and their wealth as interchangeable parts in a social machine. The money acted as a magnet, attracting a specific set of circumstances guaranteed to crush the human spirit: transactional marriages, cultural isolation, rigid conformity, mercenary partners, and biological pressure. The inheritance was the bait in a trap that snapped shut the moment the wedding vows were exchanged. Yet, if the system was so perfectly designed to destroy them, how did a few manage not only to survive, but to ultimately bend that system to their will, forging a legacy entirely on their own terms? The quiet contentment of a May Goelet was a fragile oasis in a desert of dynastic pressure. For if the curse of unearned wealth could shatter the lives of heiresses, it proved equally devastating to the men who were its intended beneficiaries, the sons and grandsons of the very tycoons who built these empires. Their inheritance was not a title to be purchased, but a fortune to be managed, a crushing weight of expectation that broke many who tried to carry it. Consider the fate of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore. He inherited not just a share of the vast railroad fortune, but the overwhelming duty to be its steward, to grow it and protect the family name. The psychological burden was immense. He drove himself relentlessly, overseeing complex business dealings and the construction of his own monstrous mansion on Fifth Avenue, a palace meant to proclaim Vanderbilt permanence. The strain literally broke him. In 1899, at the age of 55, Cornelius suffered a devastating stroke, described by doctors as a complete nervous collapse brought on by overwork and anxiety. He was left partially paralyzed and mentally diminished, a king felled by the weight of his own crown. His inheritance, meant to grant a life of limitless power, instead delivered a sentence of incapacitating stress. For other male heirs, the curse manifested not in collapse, but in careless evaporation. Without the hunger that built the fortune, they lacked the discipline to keep it. They became famous for profligate living, for yachts and racing stables and endless parties, treating the mountain of capital as a hill to be sledded down for fun. They were spenders, not builders, and the money flowed out as quickly as it had once flowed in. This is the core of the famous fall of the House of Vanderbilt. The Commodore died in 1877, leaving a fortune of $105 million, the largest accumulation of wealth in American history at that time. Yet, just 48 years after his death, at a lavish party at the very mansion Cornelius II had built, one of his own grandchildren is famously reported to have said, "It would have taken a Vanderbilt to keep up a house like this, and there are no Vanderbilts left." By that, she meant there was no longer the vast, sustaining fortune. Within 2 generations, the mountain had been leveled. The 10 great Fifth Avenue mansions were all sold or demolished. The yachts were auctioned, the art collections scattered. The curse was not a supernatural vengeance, but a simple, predictable human outcome. Sudden, dynastic wealth on that scale, disconnected from the effort that created it, often saps ambition and inflates entitlement. It removes the necessity of purpose. For the sons and grandsons, the fortune was a trap of a different design, but just as inescapable. Without the challenge of creation, many foundered in the emptiness of mere consumption or buckled under the pressure of stewardship. The result was the same dissipation and decline. This proves a crucial point. The Gilded Curse was never specific to the dollar princesses or to women alone. It was a systemic poison inherent to sudden, unearned wealth on a dynastic scale, a force that could distort and destroy lives regardless of gender, by either imposing unbearable burdens or eroding essential character. The golden cage had many doors, and all of them eventually locked from the inside. The glittering misery of these women was never a private affair. As the Gilded Age unfolded, a powerful new force was rising to document every tear, every extravagant purchase, and every crumbling marriage: the transatlantic press. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, from the New York World to London's Daily Mail, found a perfect, endless source of copy in the lives of the dollar princesses. Their stories had everything readers craved: unimaginable wealth, ancient titles, and the promise of a spectacular fall from grace. The press did not merely report on these lives, they actively shaped the narrative, turning private sorrow into public spectacle and adding a relentless, crushing layer of scrutiny to the existing curse. Every detail was fodder. When Anna Good's husband, Boney de Castellane, built his pink marble palace, the papers did not just note its cost, they published breathless inventories of its excess, from the solid gold dinner service to the lake of perfume at his parties. They juxtaposed these descriptions with pointed observations about Anna's own quiet, unfashionable demeanor. The message was clear and cruel. Here was a dull American heiress being expertly fleeced by a dazzling European adventurer. The heiress was no longer just a person. She was a character in a public morality play, a warning about the perils of new money and social ambition. This constant coverage transformed personal struggle into communal entertainment. A woman like Jennie Jerome, navigating her husband's political career and her own financial strains, had to do so under the magnifying glass of gossip columns that dissected her every friendship and every new gown. Her American spirit, which should have been celebrated, was instead framed as scandalous impropriety. The press amplified her status as a permanent outsider, ensuring that even in her own social circle, she was perpetually the topic of whispered judgment. This scrutiny created a prison of perception. There was no escape, no quiet corner where an heiress could simply be unhappy in peace. Her misery was monetized, her humiliation became headline news, and her attempts to find solace or autonomy were often twisted into further evidence of her failings. For someone like Consuelo Vanderbilt, enduring a cold marriage at Blenheim, the knowledge that the world was watching, waiting for a sign of crack in the ducal facade, must have made the vast, lonely palace feel even more suffocating. The press turned their gilded cages into glass boxes, intensifying their isolation by making their most intimate struggles a subject for breakfast table conversation across 2 continents. This public feast on their scandals did more than just humiliate. It fundamentally altered the stakes. A private marital breakdown was difficult enough, but a divorce played out in screaming headlines and sensational court reporting, as with Anna Gould, became a form of social execution. The press ensured that the curse of their inheritance was not just felt in cold castle halls, but etched permanently into the public record, a legacy of ridicule that often outlasted the fortune itself. The relentless spotlight of the press has faded, but the gilded cage never truly disappeared. Its design has simply been updated for a new century. Look at the modern heirs and heiresses, those born into fortunes that dwarf even the Vanderbilt millions, and you will see the same haunting patterns replaying in real time. Consider the tragic arc of a hotel heiress like Paris Hilton, who in her youth became a global caricature of empty wealth. A persona she has since revealed was a crafted defense against profound loneliness and a childhood spent shuttled between mansions and boarding schools. Her inheritance bought global fame, but it also constructed a prison of public perception, one where her humanity was obscured by the glittering brand of her name. Or look to the quieter, more devastating stories of lottery winners, those who received the ultimate sudden inheritance. Study after study reveals a shockingly common trajectory: windfall wealth leading to broken families, paralyzing anxiety, bankruptcy, and in some tragic cases, even early death. The money arrives as a miracle and swiftly morphs into a curse, attracting predatory friends, estranging loved ones, and stripping away the daily purpose that once gave life structure. The names and the fashions change, but the core themes are achingly familiar. A profound isolation within a crowd of sycophants, a paralyzing distrust of others' motives, and the crushing burden of expectation, whether it is to maintain a family legacy or simply to be happy now that you can afford anything. This suggests the curse was never about corsets or titles specifically. It is a timeless human story about the psychology of unearned fortune. Wealth on that scale, especially when it arrives without the struggle that built it, acts as a distorting lens. It amplifies every existing flaw in one's character and every latent dysfunction in one's relationships. It removes the common struggles that bond people together, often leaving the wealthy heir floating in a lonely orbit of their own privilege. The Gilded Age heiresses were merely early case studies in a grand, ongoing experiment. What happens when you give a person everything they are supposed to want, except for autonomy, authentic connection, and a sense of earned purpose? The result then and now is often a deep, lingering discontent, a feeling of being trapped on a golden treadmill. So we must ask, is the curse of wealth an inescapable fate? Or is there a secret, a way to hold the fortune without letting its weight crush you? The final answer may lie not in the tragic tales, but in the quiet, overlooked stories of those who managed to break the cycle. If money itself could be cursed, then the jewels it purchased were its concentrated, glittering essence. Throughout history, specific gemstones have carried legends of misfortune, their beauty shadowed by tales of tragedy, madness, and death. For the Gilded Age heiresses, these cursed artifacts became the perfect, terrifying symbols of their own trapped existences, physical manifestations of the poison that flowed with their fortune. One woman, more than any other, seemed to dare the curse to do its worst. Her name was Evelyn Walsh McLean, the last private owner of the most infamous gem in the world, the Hope Diamond. Evelyn was a quintessential American heiress, her father's fortune made in Colorado gold mines. She married into the wealthy McLean newspaper family and lived a life of spectacular, almost reckless opulence. She did not just have money, she flaunted it with a boldness that shocked even her peers. And in 1911, she saw the ultimate trophy, a 45-carat deep blue diamond with a history drenched in blood and bad luck. The stone's alleged curse was well documented. It was said to have been stolen from the eye of a Hindu idol in India, bringing disaster to a succession of owners, including King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, who both met their ends at the guillotine. Evelyn McLean bought it anyway. She was famously superstitious in some ways, yet she dismissed the diamond's dark legend, reportedly saying, "It's as good as any way to die as any other." She had the stone reset into a lavish necklace and wore it constantly, even letting her dog wear it as a collar. She seemed to believe her own vibrant, untouchable American luck could overpower centuries of grim history. The curse, whether real or a relentless coincidence, appeared to work its will. Her life, for all its glitter, became a parade of profound personal catastrophes. Her beloved son, Vincent, was killed in a car accident at the age of 9. Her husband, Ned McLean, descended into alcoholism, scandal, and mental illness, ultimately dying in a sanitarium. Her daughter, Evelyn, died of a drug overdose at just 25. The family fortune evaporated through mismanagement in the Great Depression. Evelyn herself died penniless, her jewels sold to settle debts. The Hope Diamond, which she had worn as a symbol of her invincibility, seemed instead to have charted a map of her ruin, a blue beacon tracing a path from immense wealth to utter desolation. Her story begs a haunting question. Did the cursed gem destroy her life, or was she, like the heiresses who married for titles, simply another person whose vast inheritance attracted and amplified tragedy, with the diamond serving as a glittering, focused point for the world's superstitions? Another stone, less famous but equally ominous, tells a similar tale. The Delhi purple sapphire, a large, unattractive amethyst, was looted from a temple in India during the violent upheaval of the Sepoy Rebellion. It came into the possession of a British soldier, Colonel W. Heiress, in misfortune followed him home. He and his son faced financial ruin and chronic illness. The gem was then given to a friend, a writer named Edward Heron Allen, who was a man of science, a skeptic. Yet even he became convinced of the stone's malevolence. After experiencing a string of personal and professional disasters he attributed to the sapphire, he locked it away in a box, wrapped it with protective symbols, and instructed his banker not to open it until after his death. He wrote that the stone was trebly cursed and stained with the blood and dishonor of everyone who has ever owned it. This artifact curse operates on a powerful psychological level. It provides a narrative, a story to explain random misfortune. When life delivers unbearable blows, as it did for Evelyn McLean, the human mind seeks a reason, a pattern. A cursed jewel offers a tangible villain, a darkly romantic explanation for suffering that might otherwise seem senseless. For the heiress trapped in a miserable marriage, the idea that a gemstone, and not the cold calculus of her transaction, was the source of her pain might have been a strange comfort. It externalized the poison. The curse was not in the gilded system that bought and sold her. It was in the diamond around her neck. This mystical layer added a potent, seductive dread to the heiress's predicament. Her inheritance was not just a weight of gold. It was a collection of beautiful objects, each whispering a possible doom. Every necklace, every tiara passed down through generations of a noble family might carry with it the silent echoes of past unhappiness, of marriages like her own, built on duty and despair. The jewels became heirlooms of sorrow, their facets reflecting not just light, but the trapped faces of the women who wore them before. They were the ultimate symbol of the gilded cage, exquisite, priceless, and impossible to remove without sacrificing the very identity the fortune had purchased. To take off the jewels was to reject the role, and so they wore them, these glittering weights, these condensed pieces of their curse, shining brightly for all to see while hiding the dark stories locked within their stones. Evelyn Walsh McLean did not just own the Hope Diamond. She dared it to prove its legend. The daughter of a rough and tumble Irish immigrant who struck it rich in Colorado gold, Evelyn inherited a fortune that was as wild and untamed as the mines it came from. She married into the staid newspaper wealth of the McLean family, but she never tempered her spirit. Her life in Washington, D.C. was a spectacle of Gilded Age excess, a whirlwind of parties, priceless art collections, and a level of spending that was as much a performance as a lifestyle. She once bought a string of black pearls for $150,000 simply because a rival socialite wanted them. This was the woman who, in 1911, walked into a jeweler's and laid eyes on a 45-carat deep blue diamond with a history so dark it seemed to suck the light from the room. The Hope Diamond's curse was already famous, a litany of stolen temple idols, beheaded kings, and bankrupt nobles. Evelyn, a woman of profound and contradictory superstitions, was utterly captivated. She purchased the stone, had it set as a pendant surrounded by white diamonds, and wore it almost constantly. She treated the legendary curse as a personal challenge, even a dark joke. She would pin it to her dog's collar and let the animal trot around her mansion. She lent it to friends for good luck, laughing at their nervousness. In her mind, her own vibrant American-bred fortune was a force stronger than any ancient hex. She famously said, "Bad luck is as good as any way to die as any other." But life, it seemed, was listening. The tragedies that unfolded were so profound and relentless, they read like a script written by fate itself. Her beloved young son, Vincent, was killed in a car accident at the age of 9. Her husband, Ned McLean, descended into a very public spiral of alcoholism, scandal, and mental illness. His behavior so erratic, he was eventually declared insane and institutionalized, leading to a bitter divorce. The family's newspaper empire and vast wealth evaporated through his mismanagement and the crushing force of the Great Depression. Then, her daughter, also named Evelyn, died of a sleeping pill overdose at just 25, a death ruled a suicide. Evelyn Walsh McLean, who had worn the world's most infamous jewel as a badge of fearless defiance, outlived her children, her husband's sanity, and her entire fortune. She died nearly penniless, her legendary jewels, including the Hope Diamond, sold to settle her debts. Her story presents the most haunting question of all. Was the blue diamond truly a cursed object, conducting misfortune like a lightning rod? Or was Evelyn, like the dollar princesses before her, simply a person whose vast, unearned inheritance created a world where tragedy could flourish? Her fortune bought her the ultimate trophy, but it also insulated her in a bubble of perceived invincibility, perhaps blinding her to the very real fragility of human life and happiness. She embraced the diamond's myth to add a layer of dark romance to her own narrative. Yet in the end, the personal devastation was all too real and all too human. The curse, whether supernatural or psychological, had claimed another heiress, proving that defiance alone could not shield a life built upon a foundation of glittering, precarious gold. Evelyn McLean's defiant dance with the Hope Diamond ended in ruin, but other heirs chose a radically different path to confront their fortune's weight. They did not wear their wealth as a defiant ornament or a passive burden. They actively gave it away. This was not mere charity. It was a psychological and moral strategy, an attempt to break the curse by transforming the inheritance from a source of isolation into a tool for connection. The same woman whose Vanderbilt millions had purchased her misery at Blenheim Palace, Consuelo Vanderbilt, provides a powerful early example. After her divorce, she did not retreat into bitter seclusion. Instead, she channeled her resources and her hard-won understanding of powerlessness into philanthropy, with a particular focus on women's suffrage and maternal health. She funded hospitals, supported educational initiatives, and used her social influence to advocate for the rights of women who had no voice. In doing so, she performed a profound alchemy. The fortune that had once been the instrument of her confinement became the engine of her liberation and purpose. She resurrected the energy of her curse, using it to break chains for others, and in the process, forging a meaningful identity that her purchase title never could. Her wealth was no longer a golden cage, but a key she could use to unlock doors. This idea of philanthropy as an antidote finds its most systematic expression in a family that seemed to learn the lesson early, the Rockefellers. John D. Rockefeller amassed a fortune so vast it made the Vanderbilts look like modest merchants, a fortune that attracted public hatred and fears of a curse of monopolistic greed. His son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., inherited not just the money, but the crushing weight of its reputation. Rather than succumbing to the pressure or squandering the wealth, he dedicated his life to sanitizing the family name through calculated, monumental philanthropy. He did not just give away money, he institutionalized giving. He funded the restoration of colonial Williamsburg, the creation of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and the construction of the Rockefeller Center, a project meant to symbolize benevolent capitalism. More importantly, he and his wife, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller, instilled in their children a sense of the fortune as a sacred trust, a responsibility to be managed for the public good. This was a conscious effort to break the curse of dynastic wealth by embedding a sense of purpose directly into its DNA. The third generation, including figures like Nelson and David Rockefeller, continued this work, expanding into global diplomacy, conservation, and the arts. For them, the inheritance was not a ticket to idle luxury. It was a job description. The question is whether this active stewardship truly neutralizes the poison. Does giving wealth away cleanse the psychological burden of receiving it? For some heirs, philanthropy provides the missing element their inherited lives lacked: earned purpose. It replaces the emptiness of consumption with the challenges of management and impact. It can forge a connection to the wider world, countering the isolation that so often accompanies great wealth. The heir is no longer a passive recipient, but an active participant, using their unique resources to solve problems. This can transform the narrative, both internally and publicly. The story is no longer about a spoiled descendant draining a family trust, but about a thoughtful steward continuing a legacy of giving. The curse of resentment and envy can be mitigated by a record of tangible good. Yet this path is not a perfect cure. Philanthropy at this scale brings its own set of burdens and distortions. The heir must now bear the weight of deciding which causes are worthy, of playing God with millions of dollars. It can create a different kind of isolation, surrounded by sycophants and grant seekers who see only the checkbook. There is also the risk of philanthropy becoming merely a performance, a public relations strategy to legitimize wealth that still feels unearned. Does writing a large check truly heal the internal disconnect of never having had to strive? For every heir who finds genuine fulfillment in giving, there may be another who experiences it as just another obligatory, hollow role prescribed by their birth. The attempt to break the curse through philanthropy is perhaps the most noble and proactive response to the dilemma of inherited wealth. It acknowledges the poison and seeks an antidote in service. When it works, it can transform a cursed fortune into a blessed legacy, not by hoarding its power, but by deliberately, thoughtfully letting it go. This act of release might be the only way to finally hold such an inheritance without being crushed by its weight. But this leads us to a final, unsettling thought. If giving the money away is the solution, what does that say about the money itself? Their stories echo through the marble halls of empty palaces, a chorus of whispers from a gilded cage. From the weeping bride Consuelo Vanderbilt to the defiant, ruined Evelyn McLean, these women walked a path paved with gold and lined with thorns. Their journeys force us to confront a timeless and deeply human question. Is extreme wealth a blessing or a burden? For these heiresses, the answer was painfully clear. Their fortunes were never simply money. They were the very substance of their traps. The dowries that bought duchess titles also purchased lifetimes of isolation. The jewels that adorned their necks became weights around their spirits. The castles saved by their bank accounts then served as their prisons. This was never a supernatural curse, not in any literal sense. It was the entirely predictable human cost of a system built on greed, social ambition, and the cold reduction of people to transactions. They were traded like stocks, valued for their bank balances and their fertility, then discarded when the primary deal was done. Their loneliness, their madness, their quiet despair, these were not acts of fate, but consequences. They were the bill that came due for a world that confused price with value and titles with happiness. So as the final light fades on these tales of gilded sorrow, we are left not with a fear of haunted diamonds, but with a deeper understanding. The true curse is not in the fortune itself, but in the emptiness of the exchange, the profound cost of sacrificing a human heart on the altar of social climbing. These women paid that price in full. Now we turn the question to you. Which of these haunting stories stayed with you the most? Was it the strategic misery of Consuelo, the scandalous defiance of Jennie Jerome, or the spectacular ruin of Anna Gould? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found these tales of royalty and scandal compelling, subscribe for more journeys into the hidden costs of crowns and fortunes.